端法人语言训练测验中心 （LTTC） 是台湾第一个提供外语训练与测验、培养国际化人才的专业机构。
在历任董事长、董事会的领导及各界支持下，业务稳健成长，成绩斐然。
Congratulations!
Congratulations!
Congratulations to LTTC.
This is a monumental achievement.
It is a remarkable organization.
On this very special occasion,
we wish you more successes.
See the very best of everything in the many productive years that lie ahead.
Continued success and prosperities in many more years to come.
祝福 LTC
开创新的辉煌，成为国际的标杆，
未来的成果更加亮眼，
成为台湾的100 Club 的品牌之一，
带领更多的学习者看见未来，掌握机会。
所以大家一起来高喊
LTTC
70周年
生日快乐！
生日快乐！
The LTTC was established in Taiwan in 1951. The Non-Governmental Educational Foundation offers courses and standardized tests in 6 languages, that is English, Japanese, French, German, Spanish, and Korean, to over 500,000 learners annually. Over the past 7 decades, the LTTC has constantly expanded its services to meet the evolving needs of Taiwan's social and economic development. It has designed materials, carried out a wide range of research, and hosted conferences and other academic events, and it continues to innovate. In 2021, the LTTC launched a new score reporting service, Dr. GEPT, which provides examinees with individualized feedback and learning guidance in addition to their test scores. With Dr. GEPT, an examinee's English learning journey doesn't stop once they've completed the test. Instead, it's only the beginning.
各位线上的听众以及 LTTC 的同仁们，早安！欢迎参加我们12月第一场的 LTTC 双语教学与评量讲座。现在呢，我们先请 LTTC 吴若慧研发长介绍今天的讲者。Let's welcome Dr. Wu.
Honored colleagues, both on-site and online, good morning and welcome to today's seminar, which is one in a series on bilingual education hosted by the Language Training and Testing Center, LTTC. And due to bilingual nation policy, schools and universities in Taiwan are encouraged to adopt CLIO or EMI in their bilingual education programs. And issues and problems related to the implementation of bilingual education program have emerged in the changing context. And one of the prominent issues we need to deal with is the students' diverse linguistic needs. in international, in bilingual education contexts, such as EMI in higher education. And so in today's talk, Dr. Zhang Xinyu, Cindy, will discuss these issues by examining the practices of linguistically responsive instruction in university EMI classrooms. And Cindy, Dr. Zhang, obtained her PhD from Cambridge University. She is currently an assistant professor in the Department of Foreign Languages and Literatures at National Taiwan University. Her research areas include English medium instruction, language policy, TESOL teacher development, and bilingual and multilingual education. Despite her youth, she has already published cutting-edge research in this field. I believe all of us will benefit greatly from today's seminar. Like you, I eagerly anticipate learning from Dr. Zhang. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Zhang.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for that super nice introduction. And thank you again to the Language Training and Testing Center for inviting me here today to give this talk on EMI in higher education. As mentioned earlier, my name is Cindy Chang. I am a newly appointed assistant professor in the Department of Foreign Languages and Literatures at National Taiwan University. The title of my presentation today is Re-envisioning English Medium Instruction in Higher Education through a Linguistically Responsive Approach. From what I understand, this talk today is part of a lecture series in December that will address a range of topics related to bilingual education, teaching, and assessment. These topics have become of major interest in recent years because of Taiwan's 2030 bilingual policy. A few days ago, I was told that this session today and the sessions next week will be attended by a lot of people, both online and offline. And there are those of you who are language trainers, researchers, education developers, professors from different academic communities, secondary school teachers, primary school teachers, as well as students. So I'm actually still a little bit worried that I won't be able to address the diverse kinds of needs and questions that are brought to this very unique space today. But I'll try my best to make the content today as interesting, informative, and accessible as possible to all of you. A note to mention regarding the language of the presentation today, so I'll be using primarily English, as I believe there are some of you who come from an international background, so Chinese might not be the language that you are familiar with. For me personally, I feel slightly more at ease delivering academic talks in English, as I have been socialized into academia in English. So before I start, I would just like to talk a little bit about what motivated me to do research on EMI. Before my PhD, I was a secondary school English language teacher in Shipai Junior High School in Taipei, Taiwan. So what does this have to do with EMI? To go back slightly further, to exactly 10 years ago in 2011, I was a teacher candidate preparing for the teacher qualifications exams. It was a very stressful period, and as many of you who have gone through that experience, the second stage involves a 15-minute teaching demonstration and an interview. For the teaching demonstration, a lot of us teacher candidates were told that it is better for us to teach entirely in English. It was quite clear that this was an opportunity for us to demonstrate our ability in speaking English and to show the examiners that we are proficient enough in the language or in the subject that we're specialized in. Back then, I didn't really question so much the legitimacy of this regulation. I basically did what I was told, passed the exam, and became an English language teacher a year after graduation. However, since then, I have never taught a class entirely in English to any junior high school group of students. And this discrepancy between what was expected in the teaching demonstration and what actually is practiced on the ground has stuck with me for quite a while, which eventually led me to do my PhD 5 years later. So EMI is not just a hot topic in Taiwan. It is a growing trend around the world. The growing phenomenon EMI has been described in many ways. For example, in 2009, Philipson, who has written a lot on the topic linguistic imperialism, described EMI as a pandemic. In 2015, Chappell described EMI as a galloping trend in her research paper. And Macaro, who has published extensively on the topic of EMI, uses the analogy of an unstoppable train to reflect what he is seeing regarding the expansion of EMI around the world. So from these examples, we can see that within academia, researchers actually have quite mixed feelings regarding the global spread of EMI. We're not so certain where EMI is taking us to, and it seems to suggest that it is slightly getting out of control. Today's presentation will basically be based on my very recently published paper in TESOL Quarterly. The title of this article is English Medium Instruction, English Enhanced Instruction, or English Without Instruction, the Affordances and Constraints of Linguistically Responsive Practices in the Higher Education Classroom. So as can be seen in the title, I examine EMI through the lens of linguistically responsive instruction. This paper is an extension of my PhD thesis, where I framed EMI as a form, EMI policy specifically, as a form of symbolic control. And in my thesis, I try to make visible the changing faces of language and content in higher education. In other words, I wanted to draw attention to how switching the medium instruction from one language to another could influence the way that knowledge is organized, transmitted, and acquired from the curriculum level to the classroom level and all the way to the individual level. Parts of my findings have also been published in the journal English Teaching and Learning, and this article is titled Beyond the English Box, Constructing and Communicating Knowledge Through Translingual Practices in the Higher Education Classroom. So as can be seen over here, in this paper, I look at EMI through a translanguaging lens. And what I wanted to argue is that instead of determining the language of instruction a priori, it is more important for us to consider classroom priorities, what our students need, and the specific disciplinary goals that we want to achieve in our classroom context. These should be the factors that decide what languages should be used in the classroom space, instead of a policymaker outside the classroom context to decide what languages should be used. So in today's presentation, I'll basically be recycling a lot of the ideas that I have been discussing in the past few years in some of the research papers that I've published. A quick outline of today's presentation. So as suggested in the title, this paper, or the study reported in the TESOL Quarterly paper, pretty much deals with the intersection of EMI and LRI. First, I examine EMI through the lens of LRI. Then I seek to extend the current line of LRI research to higher education contexts in East Asia. This is important as current LRI research is heavily situated in North America and in Europe. So this sets the conceptual foundation of the study. Later on, I will talk a little bit about the research design, the findings, as well as implications for policymaking and practice, both for EMI and LRI. And finally, in the last 15 to 20 minutes of today's presentation, I'll talk a little bit about some of the key discussions that I have identified in debates related to EMI in Taiwan. And these include whether the E in EMI should be defined as English only. Second, what is EMI for in an educational sense? Is it for language, for content, or for both? And finally, to what extent does EMI currently intersect with or undermine our call for multilingualism or bilingualism? So this is basically the outline of today's 1-hour talk. So as mentioned earlier, the trend of EMI is growing around the world. These two pie charts are taken from a 2014 report published by the British Council. In this report, 55 countries were surveyed, and approximately 2/3 of the countries surveyed expressed that in the past 10 years, their governments have introduced policies related to EMI. So this would be sometime between 2004 and 2014. Similarly, about the same percentage of countries predict that this trend will continue into the next decade. As this report was published in 2014, this means that they were predicting sometime between 2014 and 2024. Right now, we're nearing the end of 2021, and based on what we are observing, it is pretty accurate. The trend of EMI is picking up pace around the world. So while the promotion of EMI has received a lot of excitement and enthusiasm on the policy level, for example, we're seeing many students moving across borders to seek an international higher education degree. This is bringing revenue to many governments and also to institutions. However, there are deep concerns related to EMI that have not been so much publicly addressed. And these include the potential detrimental impact that EMI could have on academic learning or disciplinary learning, domain loss, as mentioned in the book that was published by the LTTC, Rethinking EMI, and also other social issues related to equality and access. So driven by these concerns, in the TESOL quarterly paper, I wanted to understand to what extent does EMI actually address the new demands of an increasingly multilingual student body that is a result of higher education internationalization. In other words, is EMI actually linguistically responsive? We might say because our classroom space is becoming more multilingual, there are more international students, and the fact that English is the only shared language between the lecturer and the students, of course, we will have to do EMI. English will be the language that is selected. However, is this the end of the solution? Probably not. As students and lecturers come from different backgrounds, they also come with different levels of English proficiency. So therefore, new linguistic inequalities start to emerge. And this is a topic that we'll be talking about in this presentation. Beyond language, there are also issues of knowledge. Because of EMI, what kinds of knowledge are we including in the classroom? What kinds of knowledge are we excluding in the classroom? There are also cultural issues as well. So beyond the language focus of EMI, let's hope that there will be more discussions that are related to knowledge and culture in EMI research in the future. So driven by these concerns, I have turned to the long line of research on LRI for inspiration. So it is a little bit difficult to find a Chinese translation for linguistically responsive instruction. So here I would just like to share with you a definition provided by Gallagher and Han in their publication in 2018. Here they define LRI as a set of knowledge, skills, and dispositions connected with the nature of language, language use in society, and language learning and teaching that they believe language teachers and content teachers should possess when they teach a multilingual student body. There are a number of important thinkers who promote and theorize LRI, such as those that are listed on this slide. Some of them theorize LRI through systemic functional linguistics. Some of them build on notions such as mediation, scaffolding, and apprenticeship from social cultural theory. Now, what is important to notice is that the current LRI studies primarily focus on education training for pre- and in-service teachers of primary and secondary schools. And geographically, most studies are situated in the US and Europe. This raises interesting questions as to what extent the current LRI literature would resonate with educators who are working in higher education, and more specifically with educators working in higher education outside of US and Europe. As my study was situated in a Taiwanese university context, towards the end of my literature review, I wanted to draw attention to some of the potential challenges when extending LRI to higher education in East Asia. Higher education first is unique in several ways. Unlike learners in schools, university students are usually expected to have reached higher levels of cognitive development and autonomy in thinking upon entry. For the university lecturers, as they assume that their students are more academically prepared, what they focus on in the higher education classroom is to sharpen knowledge in a particular field, which bears a sharp contrast to teachers who work in lower levels of schooling. They need to attend to a broader set of skills and knowledge in their everyday lives. So the function of higher education is primarily for the advancement and progression of knowledge, rather than the improvement of pedagogy. And this nature of higher education makes it more challenging to introduce the idea of LRI in university classrooms. Secondly, higher education in East Asia, this situation makes the introduction of LRI more challenging. As mentioned earlier, universities in East Asia are also becoming more multilingual as a result of higher education internationalization. And the language selected as the medium instruction is often English. However, English is not really widely used in the local setting, and a lot of the domestic students have expressed concerns related to comprehension and content learning. What is important to notice is that such experiences are not entirely unfamiliar for international students either, as a lot of the international students in Taiwan come from the same region and therefore deem English an L2 or L3. So this sheer diversity and number of the multilingual student body could make the implementation of LRI specifically challenging in higher education contexts in East Asia. Just to give you a sense of the diversity of the international students in Taiwan, this is data taken from the Ministry of Education statistics that was publicly available last year. So the total number of international students in Taiwan has grown from slightly over 45,000 in 2010 to slightly over 130,000 in 2019, a nearly threefold increase within a decade. Compared to our neighboring country, China, this number might seem very insignificant. But for Taiwan itself, we do see a steady increase. In particular, those from Southeast Asia have seen a steady rise, and this is a result of the new southbound policy. Among the 130,000 international students in Taiwan 2 years ago, slightly over 17,000 were from Vietnam, nearly 16,000 from Malaysia, and nearly 14,000 from Indonesia. The number of students from China usually took the lead, but due to cross-strait tensions in the past 3 years, this number is decreasing. So what does this tell us? We do have more international students coming to Taiwan, but a lot of them probably do not have understand Chinese. So this means that the demand for EMI will continue to increase. But as mentioned earlier, this does not mean that there won't be other kinds of challenges that we need to face and deal with in the future. So the two research questions that I have raised in the TESOL quarterly paper are these. First, within the higher education EMI context in East Asia, what might linguistically responsive practices look like? And second, to what needs do they respond, and how is the effectiveness of these practices perceived? To answer these two research questions, I conducted an ethnographically inspired multi-case study in one university in Taiwan. Taiwan is a typical country in East Asia that has seen a sharp increase of EMI in recent years. On the national level and also on the institutional level, a lot of the policy discourse defines the E in EMI as English only. And this was the case of the university where I conducted my fieldwork in the year 2017 and 2018. The cases here refer to a faculty profile, and this basically consists of a lecture and the class the lecturer taught. In total, during my fieldwork, I collaborated with 17 university professors from different disciplines, spanning from the natural sciences to the social sciences and the arts and the humanities. For data collection, I conducted classroom observations and semi-structured interviews with all of these 17 university lectures. So here we can see screenshots of some of the institutional EMI policies that are publicly available online. A note regarding the proportion of international students in the 17 classes I observed, it ranged somewhere between 0% to 50%, reflecting a very complex reality of higher education in East Asia that is shifting towards becoming more international. In terms of the students' English proficiency, the level of the domestic students is somewhere at B1, and for the international students, it was somewhere between B2 and C1. Now, what does the finding tell us? So based on the data that I have collected from the classroom observations and interview, linguistically responsive instruction was interpreted and practiced in a variety of ways within the policy parameters of EMI. And in the next few slides, I would like to zoom into 3 specific classroom profiles that will serve as exemplars of these 3 types of LRI, which are technical, facilitative, and social cultural approaches to LRI. So let us have a look at the first class, polymeric materials, that was taught by Dr. Meng. So this class is an elective from the Department of Material Sciences. There were 30 students in class, and all were Taiwanese. Okay, so classroom scenario 1 pretty much reflects what I observed in the 2 hours of that EMI class. So indeed, this seems to be quite different from what we would expect for an EMI course. This class was labeled as EMI. The lecture, 10 minutes into the instruction, I soon realized the lecturer primarily used Chinese for his oral instruction, but the classroom material was in English. So let us have a look of what is going on over here. The lecturer over here, Dr. Meng, tried to help his students to identify what kind of functional groups were hydrophilic. First, the suffixes philic and phobic were brought to the fore. Phobic was spelled out. Then he also explained what are the nouns and the adjectives of these two key vocabulary. Throughout his instruction, to ensure that his students comprehended the material, Dr. Meng also asked his students to translate parts of the PowerPoint slides, both in pairs or as a whole class activity. So from these examples, we can see that Dr. Meng was very much aware of the linguistic challenges that his students are facing, and he's really trying hard to address and respond to their linguistic needs by dealing directly with these language issues. So that is the reason why I call this technical approaches to LRI. However, in the interview that I conducted with Dr. Meng, it was clear that what he is seeing in terms of the linguistic struggles that his students were facing was far beyond what he could handle alone as a content lecturer. Let us have a look at what he has to say over here. I'll just read the parts that are highlighted in green. Sometimes, no matter how hard you try to explain something, the students just do not get you. For example, let's say polymers are composed of. If you have a verb that you don't understand in the sentence, then everything is destroyed. So this is a very straightforward and clear example. If you had an academic expression such as this in its passive voice, comprehension can be just hindered by one single word. As the students had to learn or take the class in person, in real time, it also became more challenging for them to keep up with the instruction. So this shows that without sufficient academic or disciplinary literacy in English, it became very difficult for content lecturers to explain any kind of content material in depth. Because of this, it was nearly impossible to ensure that the same amount of content material would be covered if the students are experiencing so many linguistic challenges, even though Dr. Meng was indeed very attentive to his students' linguistic needs. So this, I would say, would be the limitation of LRI. Dr. Meng was linguistically responsive, but if students experience so many linguistic struggles, what should we do? The second profile that I would like to draw your attention to is the class Junior Structural Dynamics. So this class was taught by Dr. Wen. This class is an elective from the Department of Civil Engineering. In this class, there were 15 of them. All were Taiwanese except for one from South America. Like Dr. Meng, Dr. Wen was also very attentive to his students' needs. However, his ways of responding to his students' needs was more through a facilitative approach. And what do I mean by facilitative approach? He tried to create opportunities in class to maximize his students' participation in the classroom activities. Dr. Wen is quite special. He participated in a lot of CLIL-related and EMI-related professional development workshops. So he embedded a lot of CLIL-inspired activities into his teaching, which is considered quite unusual for a science class in higher education. So this is a lengthy scenario, but let me talk a little bit about what happened in the first hour first. So in this class, this is a 2-hour class, Dr. Wen was very clear that he's going to teach junior structural dynamics through a CLIL approach. So what does he mean by a CLIL approach? In the first hour, he started the class by giving the students handouts with a key vocabulary of what they're going to cover this week. He asked the students to look up these words online and to match them with the correct definition. And then he asked the students in pairs to fill out an extended closed test that was basically a 4-page summary of the content that he was going to teach that week. And after that, the lecturer went on to give a very brief lecture on the topic of that week. So that was basically the first hour of the course. In the second hour, he moved on to introduce a simplified version of a jigsaw activity. And he gave a very lengthy, a very thorough introduction of how this jigsaw discussion would unfold. So I will just summarize the green parts that are highlighted over here. First, he explained a little bit about what he expects by the end of this discussion. He explained a little bit about the context of the topic, the organization of the groups, the specific tasks assigned, and also gave some examples. Finally, he also provided his students some strategies of what they could use when they're doing the discussion. For example, they can use smartphones, they can discuss with each other. He gave them a lot of time to really reflect on the material. And finally, what is interesting to notice is that he explicitly encouraged his students to use Chinese to report their discussion findings as a whole class activity. In the follow-up interview with Dr. Wen, he said that what he believes EMI is trying to do is just to regulate the lecturer's oral instruction. For the students, what he cares about the most is that the students are able to participate in the classroom activities, regardless of whether it is Chinese or English. He did note that, as highlighted earlier, that there is one student from South America. This student, he understands Chinese. So that is the reason why he encourages his students to use Chinese, because he knows that the international student will not feel left behind in such discussions. So in the follow-up interview with Dr. Wen, he also explained a little bit further about how he understands the differences between an EMI and CLIL. Let us have a look at what he has to say. So again, just the green parts. Traditional EMI is straightforward, just like any other lecture. It's just switching to English. The lecturer and the students don't really interact. CLIL, however, is more interactive. Okay, the last green part, they are all participating in the activities. So here we can see, back to this facilitative approach to LRI, what Dr. Wen cared about the most was to maximize his students' opportunity to engage or be involved in the learning process. He wants his students to shoulder more responsibility in the process of learning, and he believes that he could do so by carefully designing the activities in his class. However, a note to mention is that enhanced interaction does not necessarily guarantee better retention in the content material, as highlighted over here in red. Dr. Wen was not exactly certain whether these enhanced activities meant that the students really understood the content or not. So the last profile that I would like to show you is the class Religion and Society. So this class was offered by Dr. Pan, and this is a general education course. There were 72 students in class, and with approximately 50% marked as international. Like the previous lecture, Dr. Pan over here also values interaction, even though she does not know the term CLIL. So this is a lengthy classroom scenario. Basically, this is the first few minutes of the class that I observed. So because this class is Religion and Society, the lecturer at the very beginning of the course invited her students to recall what they learned in the previous class. The parts that are highlighted in green are the students' responses. We can see at the very beginning, the students were a little bit hesitant. From this response, it seems that they were talking about who is considered an outsider and insider when they're discussing about issues related to religion. As time unfolded, more students jumped in, and we can see that they were able to give lengthier responses in English. For example, S2 over here says, we were discussing if someone who does not believe in a religion can understand and study a religion, or if it's not possible. S3 here says, believers question, for example, if someone is a Christian but doesn't go to church regularly, does that still make them Christian? So from these examples, we can see that they're actually engaging in quite a meaningful and in-depth conversation in the beginning of the course. However, if we really look at who were speaking, who are the students speaking, these were all international students. So for Dr. Pan, she was very aware of this imbalance of representation in class, and she tried to embed certain strategies to elicit the participation of those who think that their English proficiency is not that high. So that is the reason why I call this social cultural approaches to LRI. She was very culturally aware and linguistically sensitive and adaptive to the students' diverse needs and backgrounds. How did Dr. Pan do so? In this example, we can see that Dr. Pan was introducing to her students the Taiwanese god 土地公. So let us have a look at this example over here. So she did use Chinese over here, 土地公, and she was very much aware that it is actually not allowed in her university because her university follows an English-only EMI policy. She did explicitly acknowledge this by saying, actually, I'm not allowed to use Chinese. However, she follows this with a explicit justification of why she is using Chinese. It's just to help you understand the material. In the follow-up interview with Dr. Pan, she did say that she thinks the use of Chinese could get the attention of Chinese-speaking students, such as the domestic Taiwanese students or students from Hong Kong. And for her, what is important in her class is to kind of create a safe space for students coming from different backgrounds to share their ideas with each other and learn from each other. And she believes that this kind of opportunity is very valuable, especially in the social sciences, arts, and humanities, where culturally specific perspectives are appreciated. Okay, so what do these findings tell us? The different approaches to LRI that have been identified in this study helped alleviate immediate concerns related to lecture comprehension and classroom participation. In some situations, the need to be linguistically sensitive further opened up new pedagogical possibilities, such as when some lecturers experimented with CLIL in their traditional science classes, and also moments for intercultural exchange, like when we see Taiwanese students and international students sharing their ideas with each other and learning from each other. So these are all considered affordances of LRI, and what we see in this study pretty much aligns with the benefits of LRI that can be found in the current LRI literature. However, a major challenge that emerged in the study centered on the students' restricted academic English proficiency, especially among the local Taiwanese. As students struggled to cope with additional demands that rose from learning in bilingual or multilingual environments, the lecturers found themselves attending to a range of language issues that were so basic that it took away time and attention from the teaching of disciplinary knowledge. So returning to the title of the TESOL quarterly paper, while EMI may have been intended as English-enhanced instruction, in reality, it faces the risk of turning into English without instruction if too much focus is on language and too little on content knowledge. So what is the main message that I would like you to get out of this presentation? The lectures in the study, to emphasize again, were linguistically adaptive as they tried to address different learning needs within the policy parameters of EMI. Yet the approaches adopted were likely not enough to help students systematically build up their academic and disciplinary literacies for higher order engagement. So what I would like to argue is that aside from equipping lecturers with the dispositions, knowledge, and skills to be linguistically responsive, it is at the same time necessary to facilitate linguistically responsive practices, not just within the classroom, but also beyond. Basically, what I mean is that we should expand the I in LRI to include policymaking and curriculum planning. To be linguistically responsive is not just the responsibility of individual lecturers. Policymakers also have to reflect on whether the way that EMI is defined right now actually responds to the diverse student needs. And this could be linguistic and could also be academic. So this is basically the end of the study reported in the TESOL quarterly paper. Now, I would just like to extend the discussion further to some of the debates that have been occurring in public discourse related to EMI in Taiwan. And some of the questions that I will cover include, first, as mentioned earlier, is the E in EMI English only? Second, what is EMI for in an educational sense? Is it for language or content or both? And finally, to what extent does EMI intersect with or undermine the call for promoting bilingualism? I will start with the first question. Is the E in EMI English only? Let us take a brief moment to revisit Maccarroll's definition of EMI. I'm certain a lot of you have seen this definition many, many times. So McCarroll, in his book published in 2018, he defines EMI as the use of the English language to teach academic subjects other than English itself in countries or jurisdictions where the first language of the majority of the population is not English. This definition is deliberately provocative, as acknowledged by McCarroll himself, and he has problematized this definition too. Some of the questions he raised are, who are the actors behind the use of the English language? How much use are we talking about? What kind of English language is it? And while language teaching courses are not considered or counted as part of academic subjects in this definition, how would applied linguistics and literature be categorized? And also, why are we only counting countries or jurisdictions where the first language of the majority of the population is not English? Regarding the last questions, due to heightened transnational migration, some scholars argue that large international populations in pockets of the UK or Australia, for example, make the situation no less different from teaching and learning in the context described in McCarroll's definition. So we can see over here, this is basically how McCarroll understands EMI. And McCarroll's definition is one of the most widely cited definition of EMI right now. So the purpose of showing this definition or revisiting the definition, again, is to come back to how the Ministry of Education defines EMI. It was actually a little bit difficult to identify how the Ministry of Education actually understands what EMI is until very recently. For those of you probably on the other side of the camera who do not work in higher education context in Taiwan, the Ministry of Education introduced the BEST program in April this year, and in Chinese it is 大专校院学生双语化学习计划. So the purpose of introducing this program basically is to encourage universities to offer more EMI courses and also to encourage universities to raise students' English proficiency. Now let us have a look at how EMI is finally defined in this document that was released just this July. I'll switch to Chinese right now, okay? EMI 是指在英语非母语的教育机构提供的学习课程. So here we can see 英语非母语的教育机构. We can see traces of McCarroll's definition. Let us continue with the later half of the definition provided by the Ministry of Education. 其内容的传递、师生互动、学习及学术支持教材、学习成果展示与评量100%使用英语. This 100% use of English is probably what is making a lot of people extremely uncomfortable. Is there research evidence to support this? We don't know. This is something that I think educators should demand the Ministry of Education to give a clear explanation. Indeed, McCarroll does not really explain what he means by the use of the English language. However, if we turn to the field of language education, it is quite clear that in recent years, we're talking about translanguaging, which is the opposite of a monolingual ideology. So this 100% use of English is something that probably needs more research evidence to support this kind of a definition of EMI that is given by the Ministry of Education. Of course, one may argue that in point 3 and point 4, it seems that certain amounts of Chinese are tolerated. And it says that at least 70% of English should be used in such EMI courses. Again, where does the 70% come from? 2 days ago, the British Council gave a professional development workshop to many universities in Taiwan. They did mention about the 70%, but they said, don't stress too much about it. Just imagine if there were a British person in class, that person would have to understand what is going on in the class. I would say, of course, if there were international students in class, we have to take care of their linguistic and learning needs. So the language of instruction would naturally be in English. However, such considerations are more bottom up. It is not decided by an outsider, by the policymakers. And again, to be bilingual should work on both ways. While we will accommodate to the learning needs of international students, I don't think it would be entirely unreasonable to ask international students or any foreigners in Taiwan to also learn the language in Taiwan. So this is a bilingual effort that should be collaboratively, that everyone should collaboratively commit to. So this brings me to the second question. What is EMI for in an educational sense? Here, I would like to share with you the language content spectrum that was first introduced by Met in 1998. This spectrum has been expanded and refined by a number of established scholars over the years, such as Lister and Bollinger, Airy, and Maccaro. As can be seen over here, EMI is situated on the content end of the spectrum. It is content-driven. It is primarily for content. On the opposite side of the spectrum, we see terms or words including EGP, EAP, ESP, which stands for English for general purposes, English for academic purposes, and English for specific purposes. These are more language-driven. In the middle of the spectrum, we have these terms, content-based instruction, immersion, and content and language integrated learning, because these types of education have a dual focus on both language and content. Now, in recent years in policy discourse, there seems to be a trend that EMI is moving towards the middle part of the spectrum, as there is an added expectation for EMI lectures to also take care of raising the students' English language proficiency in their EMI courses. And Moncado, Comas, and Block call this a clearalized EMI. However, I would argue, who wouldn't want to be in the middle part of the spectrum? Who wouldn't want to claim that I can do both language and content in the same classroom space? What does this middle space mean? Is it 50% content, 50% language, or 100% content and 100% language? If there were a situation when there is just 30% content and 20% language, where does it belong on the spectrum? So in my thesis, I have introduced this dynamic language content model for us to trace more specifically what is intended, enacted, and actually achieved. So how can we read this model? This model consists of two axes, language and content. Language with 3 pluses indicate a stronger focus on the planning, teaching, and learning of language. The opposite end, language with 1 plus, indicate a weaker focus, but not necessarily an absence of what is labeled. The same logic applies to the content axis. And with these two axes combined, this creates 4 quadrants. From quadrant 1 to quadrant 4, the relationships between language and content are a strong integration between the two. That is quadrant 1. Quadrant 2, a moderate integration with content prioritized. Quadrant 3, a weak integration. And in quadrant 4, a moderate integration with language taking the lead. Now we can map the bilingual terms that we saw along the language content spectrum onto this model. What we can do further is to trace their developments and how they move from one discursive level to another. For example, while EMI may have been conceptualized as content-driven, or even better, content and language-driven, which is somewhere in quadrant 1 and 2, in reality, it could face the risk of turning to or moving to quadrant 3 if only little language and content were learned in the end. This is a space that does not exist on the language content spectrum, which makes this model important as it helps us understand the instructional outcomes of EMI. Now, finally, regarding the 2030 bilingual policy, the final question was, to what extent does EMI intersect with or undermine our call for bilingualism? While there are currently no languages in Taiwan assigned official status, all mother tongues spoken by local ethnic groups and Taiwan Sign Language have since 2018 been protected and recognized by the National Languages Development Act. So if Taiwan is already a multilingual nation, then what does becoming bilingual mean in the 2030 bilingual policy? Some more notes regarding bilingual education. Bilingual education means very different things across context. It's not necessarily an inherently good thing. If we look at the US, discussions related to bilingual education often involve advocating for the immigrants, the immigrant children. Basically, what is discussed is that they want to try to include the minority languages into mainstream education, acknowledge the languages that they bring into the US. So there's a social justice agenda behind the discussion of bilingual education. In Europe, content and language integrated learning is considered an European version of bilingual education. Right now, we are seeing the L in CLIL oftentimes it means English. However, in the 1990s, when CLIL was introduced in Europe, there was a vision that this could help further the integration of different countries within continental Europe. So the language selected was often the language of neighboring countries. Returning our gaze back to Taiwan, the language that we're talking about in bilingual education is English. This is a language that already enjoys a tremendous amount of power. And with this overemphasis of English, there are concerns that it could pose potential threats to the well-being of other languages locally. So these considerations are actually, I think right now we're definitely seeing more discussions in the news or in opinion editorials in Taiwan. And actually just last week, Professor Alan Prasad also gave a talk, a thought-provoking talk titled as The Dead End Bilingualism, and basically sharing very similar sentiments regarding the insistence on English and how this could be very problematic. Of course, there might be deeper political motivations behind the 2030 bilingual policy. As Taiwan sees the rise of China, the Taiwanese government is considering, or probably is considering, different ways to distance itself from the influence of China and seeking to diversify its relationship with the international community. So whether this focus on English could actually make us more visible on the international stage and secure our identity as a Taiwanese, this is a trickier question and probably cannot be answered in the short term. So just to recap, is the E and EMI English only according to what we see in research? Probably not, okay? What is EMI for? Is it for language or for content? EMI primarily is for content. If EMI lecturers want to include language teaching and learning components into their classroom, that's perfectly fine, as long as the students know what do they mean by language and how is it planned, taught, and learned, just to make it explicit. However, if the teaching and learning of language interferes with the teaching of content in these EMI classes, then I would argue probably it's not a good idea to EMI, because ultimately, university professors, what they care about is the advancement of knowledge in their field. So this bears a sharp contrast with what is focused in primary and secondary school settings. Finally, to what extent does EMI intersect with or undermine the call for promoting bilingualism? Currently, the way that EMI is understood, English only, is the antithesis of bilingualism. If we have a look at the 2030 bilingual policy or the policy documents that have been issued by the Ministry of Education, it is mostly about English. So I would say that we probably need more clarity of what we mean by bilingual education, or is it actually just English language education? If it's just English language education, then why don't we become more honest about this? This is basically the end of my presentation, and in the final few slides, I would just to highlight that there are a number of books related to EMI published in recent years. There are also a number of very research active scholars in Taiwan who are writing and publishing about EMI. The book on the left is published by the team in National Cheng Kung University. The book on the right, I'm advertising for the Language Training and Testing Center. Yes, I share very similar perspectives with what has been written in this book. I still need to read some other chapters, but I look forward to it. So Rethinking in EMI was published by the LTTC very recently this year. And so we do have a lot of research energy regarding EMI within Taiwan. So this is a positive sign. And finally, for those of you who are considering to offer EMI courses, who are looking for something more practical, this book published by Professor Liao from NTNU is a very useful resource book for lecturers who want to advance their classroom English discourse, perhaps more individually. So thank you very much for being here today and for inviting me, and I very much look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you for giving us such informative and insightful speech. I think it's time for question and answer or any comments. I know that I think colleagues would like to raise some questions, right? Yeah?
Yeah. I'd like to ask one question. So based on the LRI approaches found to be adopted by the EMI teachers in your study, how would you suggest EAP or ESP courses be enhanced to provide an institutional support for university students who plan to take the EMI courses?
I would say the offering of EAP and ESP courses is a linguistically responsive approach to tackling the many linguistic struggles that the students are facing. So this kind of aligns with what I have been arguing for towards the end of the presentation, is that aside from asking individual lecturers to do everything by themselves, probably we need to work on curriculum alignment, or what, from what I understand from reading the LTTC book, Rethinking EMI, you guys call it a dual track, right? So just a tighter integration of the language track and content track, so that we can ensure that students' different needs, academic and linguistic, are both taken care of.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I know there's a question waiting online, right? So let's take.
Okay. This is Seth. Thank you, Dr. Zhang. Could you talk more about your method and analysis? For example, how did you manage inter-rater reliability in your qualitative study?
Oh, okay. I feel I'm going back to my Viva. So I'd say yes, it is a qualitative study, and the ways that I adopted to improve inter-rater reliability, I would probably avoid this term because this term is used more in quantitative research. But of course, I want to make sure that what I'm reporting represents the voices of the participants. So after interviewing the participants, I transcribed everything and sent it back to them to check the transcriptions within 2 weeks. So that was the first stage. And throughout my thesis writing process, I contacted the professors every few months to share with them updates of my research progress. So this is a second way. And the third way is that I went to several conferences, academic conferences, to share my data to make sure that what I'm saying is clear enough to other researchers. And if they had any questions, I also became more sensitive of the limitations that I had, so I could go back to the participants and share with them my concerns, and just to make sure that whatever I'm representing or sharing is reflective of what they have been trying to tell me along the way. Thank you.
All right. Any more questions from the floor here? Yeah, John.
Just from what you've seen, like you pointed out that very often in the mixed classrooms, the international students that were around B2 or C1, whereas most of the Chinese students were around B1. Do you see this is just going to be a rough 10 years until all the early education of students from current elementary age actually get to university? Or yes, presumably the English education is starting earlier, and the students will be more proficient in, eventually be more proficient in English when they get to university 10 years from now. So is this, I mean, obviously there are many things we have to do now to make this work, but do you think it's going to get easier, or is this just going to continue to be a problem for the next 30 years?
I think with the effort that we're putting into kind of enhancing English language education itself, we would see some kind of difference 10 years later. However, with the enhancement of English proficiency, this is a long-term project. I think if by 2030 we are not really seeing the expected results, that is completely fine. Because according to a lot of bilingual education researchers, usually when they say like to become bilingual, it takes decades. It's not just an issue of something that you could do within a decade. And what is more important is to make sure that this continues, and that we are also taking care of the other languages in Taiwan, to make sure that we are not focusing too much on English, but sacrificing the well-being of other languages at the same time. But I do think that there will be positive changes because there's so much effort put into it right now.
Thank you.
I think there was a question over here, right?
Yeah, I saw that very thank you for the talk. Thank you for the talk. It's very informative.
Thank you.
I learned a lot. And personally, I really enjoyed the part when you said about how we needed to do the teaching demonstration in English, even though we're not sure if the students are going to be able to understand in the future when we're actually teaching. The question I have is that because you mentioned translanguaging, and I was wondering that what's the relationship with the LR and translanguaging, because I think we've seen some similarity there, because they're all responsive to the students who have like multilingual backgrounds.
Right.
And I also saw like Gabriel, it's one of the names mentioned in the paper. So I was wondering, is it possible to say that translanguaging is like an extension of this model LRI here? Is that the relationship there?
I would say there are a lot of similarities between these two concepts, and basically they intersect with each other. They shouldn't be competing with each other. Translanguaging is understood in different ways. On the practice level, it is often considered basically the same as code switching. So if we understand translanguaging as code switching, then we can say code switching is definitely a strategy for us to be more linguistically responsive when we're teaching. Translanguaging research is also coming more theoretical and conceptual. There are a lot of scholars coming from different backgrounds trying to advance the theorization of translanguaging. And this is something that probably I would say the direction of how it's being theorized is a little bit different from the research that have been conducted in the field of LRI itself. LRI, this term emerged in the US, as mentioned earlier. However, it has never really kind of expanded outside of the North American and European context. So whether this would actually pick up pace in the next few years, we still have to see how it will develop. But translanguaging is picking up a lot of attention globally. So I think with a lot of cross-pollination of different ideas, probably we'll see something that would become quite transformative and will raise the awareness of a lot of educators and hopefully policymakers in terms of the importance of this approach. Thank you.
Well, this is a follow-up question.
Okay.
About LRI. So
right.
I'm curious, like, for people who are worried about the privileging of English,
right.
in the classroom, or the forced assimilation of different modes of knowledge construction into, the English mode.
Right.
How does LRI not only respond to language, but let's say the language game of knowledge construction? Let's assume that different languages have their own way of organizing, transmitting, or, as you say, acquiring knowledge. How does LRI do justice to different modes of knowledge construction? Let's say, modes that are embedded in different language games. Yeah.
I think this is a very interesting question. I personally thought of LRI as something based on the literature. I think I was influenced a lot by what I've been reading in the literature is that right now the discussion seems to be really focused on the classroom level, and there hasn't been a lot of discussion on what happens on the knowledge building level. But how can we kind of, I think your question is how can we use LRI to facilitate the construction and communication of knowledge in different disciplinary communities?
So that it doesn't just respond to the language. Let's say,
right.
Everybody can, translanguaging, everybody can use your own language, but, to the deeper knowledge construction that is embedded in the different languages. Yeah. How
knowledge construction that is embedded in different languages.
Different ways, different ways of acquiring knowledge, for people who use different languages. Yeah.
I think your question, just to make sure whether I'm understanding your question correctly or not, is that are we just talking about language issues in LRI?
No, not just language issues.
Not just language issues, right?
Yeah.
And how can we tie that with?
Yeah, as you say.
Different knowledges.
Right.
Different knowledge building in different fields.
This sounds like very complicated questions. So maybe it takes more time for discussion. So maybe afterwards, that Harry can go to Cindy. I know that there's another question.
Sorry. Yes, I actually would respond to that at a later point.
There's an online a question from our online participant. Regarding the challenges local students face in terms of English proficiency, how would you suggest English teachers in high schools and freshman English professors to do to improve students' English? I know you have some high school teaching experience, so can you address this question?
I come from a junior high school teacher background, but I suppose this question is raised because the speaker probably is not so happy with the kind of English language education that he or she is receiving right now. And back then when I was an English language teacher, I was also very much concerned about that. Of course, I think when we talk about improving pedagogy or the ways of like teaching English, there's so many approaches in which we could advance our pedagogy and our teaching of English. And this is something that a lot of English language educators and professors are doing right now, actually. But if the comparison point is to compare English language teaching education with that is provided in English-speaking countries or in Hong Kong or Singapore, I wouldn't think that is a fair comparison. If that is if that question is basically is trying to ask like why can't we be like students from those contexts, because the context is different in Taiwan. We are an EFL context. So the opportunities of learning English and using English is naturally different. And there's a limitation of what English language educators could do too. Yeah.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Right.
I think that our concern, because in the cases you mentioned, we saw the efforts of subject area teachers to address students' English problems or help them. But for example, at the university level, from an institutional perspective, can, for example, language centers, for example, an language center in the university, cooperate with the sub-area teachers to have kind of, for example, parallel mode or different kind of models to have a special maybe EAP support channel to help the subject area teachers.
Sure.
Yeah. And also, next question is, I think, from senior high school teachers' perspective, because it seems now they need to get students ready to take EMI courses sort of. So I think the teacher's question is, how can senior high school teachers to help students to be ready?
Okay, sorry for my misunderstanding. I thought that question was asked by, not by a teacher. I would say, kind of responding to the question that was raised earlier regarding the EAP and ESP support, I definitely would encourage collaboration between content lectures and language lectures, especially in the university context, as there's so much expertise in so many areas of knowledge. For high school, I actually never really thought about the idea of introducing EAP into high school context, but I think that is actually a pretty good idea. It's just quite difficult to introduce it if we're already experiencing so many challenges in university settings. But at the same time, that does not mean that we can start incorporating some elements of EAP into high school English language instruction, especially for those high schools that are more academically driven or oriented.
Okay, I have a question.
Right.
Okay. Do you consider assessment also an issue in EMI? Because I've been considering the implications of LRI.
Right.
Yeah, for assessment, for EMI assessment. What do you think?
I would say I don't come from a background of assessment, but I am aware that assessment is an area that has not does not have enough research focus in the field of EMI currently. Assessment is a very tricky issue. For example, for a physics professor, their priority is to teach physics, right? So even if they do switch their medium instruction to English, does that mean they're going to test their students' English? Is it the responsibility of the physics professor to take care of raising the students' English proficiency? Now, even if the professor does not aim to test the students' English proficiency and all the exam papers are also switched to English, then what happens when language issues interfere with the students' expression of what they learn, right? Indeed, there have been some professors who have addressed this issue by changing the types of questions that they ask. For example, back then they might have asked more open-ended essay questions, but because of EMI, probably they need to switch with multiple choice questions or fill in the blanks. So of course, there are certain strategies for us to kind of comfort ourselves that EMI does not have any academic repercussions on the outcomes of learning. But the way that, you said assessment, the way that we assess students is something that we need to look deeper into. Like, to what extent does EMI actually interfere with the focus of the subject learning process in university classrooms? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. All right. How much time? We have?
Well, maybe 5 minutes.
5 minutes? So,
I think I'll just quickly respond to, it was Henry, right?
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Are there disciplines that are more amenable to EMI? Let's say, disciplines that deal with thinner concepts, not thick concepts. Like, concepts that are easily translated into English. Like,
sure.
Yeah.
Yes. I would say like in Taiwan, like a lot of, for the undergraduate level, we're seeing more disciplines in the social sciences switch to English, EMI. And by social sciences specifically, it is business management, these kind of internationally oriented subjects. It is easier to switch to English medium instruction. And also in the sciences, as a lot of the science material that the professors are using to begin with are already in English, and the textbooks that are used in science departments in NTU are oftentimes already in English. So it may seem that it is easier to switch to EMI in those contexts. However, in my research, something that I did not discuss in the TESOL quarterly paper is that even though there are certain subjects that may seem to be more easily switched to English, the students' English proficiency is a major concern. For example, in the university where I did my fieldwork, the students from the science departments had the lowest level of English proficiency. So while it's easier for the professor to switch in English, the students are not completely ready for it. So there are other concerns to take into consideration when we're deciding which subject or when exactly or how to switch to English. Right. I hope I have answered your question.
So one more question here.
Okay.
So in Dr. Zhang's opinion, based on your previous teaching experiences and research results, what revisions should be made in Taiwan's bilingual policy? Because policy serves as a driving force for practices.
For advice for policy or?
Yeah, your suggestions for the Taiwan's bilingual policy.
Right.
Based on teaching experiences and the results of the research.
I guess all of you could sense a sense of kind of frustration of what we could actually do at this point. I come from a teaching background, so I know what teachers are facing. I thought that once I become a researcher and academic, I would have a louder voice. But then I realized that this is a bigger issue that is beyond me. But I think that what I'm seeing that is positive is that we're talking more about this topic and people are talking about different languages, the relationship of different languages. And this is a positive sign. Of course, in terms of how we could change the policy, I think this is a collective effort. And it is a collective effort. I think we can only see changes over a period of time. And I would say be active when we have questions, raise them, do our best in our professional roles to speak out. And if we have chances to interact with any policymakers or any people who have any influential power, then definitely express this concern as, like to become bilingual is something that we would like to work towards too, but the way that it is being implemented right now, I think needs a lot of refinement. And the the way to deal with it is not to blame teachers and tell teachers that if you're not following the policy, you're lazy. This is a sentiment that I'm hearing from teachers. And what I hope is that policymakers will actually really listen to the concerns and the challenges that the teachers are facing, because their concerns and challenges are very legitimate. And they're also working towards to becoming bilingual and multilingual, but just through different ways. Why aren't there ways of reaching this ultimate goal not taken into serious consideration? So basically, I think what I would just hope for is more dialogue on this topic, and hopefully we will also be able to see some changes on the policy level in the longer run. Thank you.
Thank you. I think time is up, and it's time for me to conclude today's event. So first of all, thank you again, Cindy, for giving us this wonderful speech, very insightful and informative. And they are very useful. All these, your thoughts are very useful for our work at the LTTC. And I actually have wrote a reflection while I was listening to your talk. And just let me read aloud. Bilingual education is so complex that we do need to take necessary contextual factors into consideration. And this is the complexity that makes the field, bilingual education, a new and interesting minefield to explore for us. So thank you again. And let's continue working together and to make sure the implementation of bilingual education in our country more appropriate and more effective also for our learners, benefit our learners. Yeah, thank you again. Yeah, thank you.